I will be talking about one particular film, Edward Young's EE, a 1 and a 2. So a little bit about my research background. It's primarily in Chinese, Taiwanese, and Hong Kong cinemas. And so it's an honor to be here and talk to all of you guys, experts on Taoism. So this paper is part of my dissertation, which is a larger project on the connections between Taoist thought and contemporary Sinophone cinemas. My driving questions are, how is Taoism transmitted or adapted in contemporary Sinophone cinemas? And how does centering the religious and spiritual traditions complicate notions of secular and homogeneous time fashioned by the nation state? So the linkages I'm going to draw here are not necessarily straightforward or causal about tradition kind of influencing modern forms, but rather it's more of like an interpretive process where I'm trying to excavate certain roots and references to Taoism in these films. Okay, so I hope some of you guys have seen this film. But if not, I will provide a short summary. So Edward Young's EE, translated into English as a 1 and a 2, conjures the image of a conductor waving his baton before launching into a performance. True to its musical title, the film is an orchestral masterpiece that weaves together many melodies of everyday life in 21st century Taipei. The movie follows 3 members of a middle-class Taiwanese family as they live their everyday lives: the soft-spoken patriarch NJ, the teenager Ting Ting, and budding artist Yang Yang. They live in a small apartment with their mother and maternal grandmother, who trips and falls into a coma shortly after attending an ill-advised wedding. The family's apartment, which is cozy and lived in, becomes a gathering ground for the family members and the holding space for the comatose grandmother. It is inside, outside, and from the 3rd floor window of the building's balcony that the characters' lives mainly play out. So this film is widely considered one of the masterpieces of the Taiwanese New Wave, whose style can be described as observational, realistic, and sympathetic portrayals of Taiwanese life that reflected the cultural and historical context at the time. And so what was happening at the time in Taiwan? So to kind of cover it briefly, economically, in the mid-1980s, Taiwan experienced a tremendous amount of economic growth due to a transition from state-led industrialization to an export-driven neoliberal economy and market specialization. Politically, it was cut off from having formal diplomatic ties with the US in 1979, which marginalized Taiwan on a global stage. The 1980s also saw the dissolution of martial law due to democratic reforms that led to the first presidential election in 1996. And then I also wanted to cover kind of what religion looks like in Taiwan briefly. So since the end of martial law, Taiwan has enjoyed a freedom of religion, and the majority of the Taiwanese population practice a combination of Buddhism and Taoism that's merged with a Confucian worldview, as well as certain practices from Chinese folk religion. Okay. So why is it important to conduct a Taoist reading of this film, as well as certain other films that are in my dissertation? Well, I'm trying to situate the wider significance of my argument in discussions about the post-secular, which is the idea that religion remains an important part of public life rather than disappearing with the onset of secular modernity. Which is the secularization thesis, that the more society secularizes, the more religion kind of disappears in the inverse relationship. So Jürgen Habermas was one of the earliest people to invoke the term post-secular in 2008, which he used to discuss the rise of religious conflicts between Islamic and Judeo-Christian civilizations and the need in Europe to integrate migrants and refugees who were religious. In contrast, I situate my post-secular readings of these films in the Sinophone context of China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and during the contemporary era, which are all periods of rapid neoliberal transformation. So for this presentation, I'm going to look at how the philosophical orientation of EE resonates with Taoist attitudes towards time and process and transformation. Okay. So one of the things that I noticed while doing research on this film is that it is a big challenge for critics and academics to decipher or to even kind of put into words like what is so special about this film. As you know, this film won Best Director at the Cannes Film Festival. And so there's something here, there's a kernel here that is very moving to people. But for instance, A.O. Scott of the New York Times writes, movies are inherently sometimes cheaply emotional medium. It takes a lot to make a grown critic cry. As I watched the final credits of EE through bleary eyes, I struggled to identify the overpowering feeling that was making me tear up. Was it grief, joy, mirth? Yes, I decided it was all of these, but mostly it was gratitude. And so I wanted to take this as a starting point to examine these strong yet difficult to name feelings. And one way we can think about it is from the perspective of French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, who kind of describes these strong, unnameable feelings as affective rather than emotional. And for him, affect is a kind of movement away from preconceived emotions, and thus it's difficult to describe in language. Another method, I think, of interpretation is kind of looking at Taoist philosophy, and the first famous line of Lao Tzu, saying that the Tao that can be described is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be spoken is not the eternal name. So there's a sort of kind of engagement with ineffability there, that the Tao is somehow there, but it cannot be spoken. And so one of the strengths of cinema is that it doesn't always need language. It uses its own cinematic language, which includes narrative storytelling and editing to articulate what cannot be fully captured in words. So one of these techniques that I will discuss is the long take. Going back to the film, a lot of critics kind of talk about it as a film about urban alienation and loneliness. However, it also goes underneath the cliches of urban life and seeks sort of philosophical answers to big questions, such as the meaning of life and death and the passage of time, and how tradition morphs and adapts to a secular materialistic society. So the film makes abundant use of the long take and slow pacing to highlight transitional, unremarkable moments in life to be equally, if not more significant than action and plot movement. So while the film isn't short of drama, including a murder, a suicide attempt, a hasty marriage, infidelity, a funeral, the drama is subordinated to quieter moments that characterize the durational flow of time. So scenes move gracefully and music or dialogue sometimes spills over the frames. So life is happening in the margins of the narrative and in still moments in between plot motion. And instead of demanding our attention using plot twists and turns, this film works mostly at an affective, spiritual, and meditative level. And so this kind of durational time has been elaborated by Gilles Deleuze, drawing on Henri Bergson's notion of durational time. However, I wonder if we can also use a Taoist lens to read this durational temporality, which emphasizes the process of unfolding. So while Deleuze is looking at an archive of primarily European and American films and kind of categorizing them under the label of the time image, in the context of this film, I argue that the long take acquires a meaning that is tied to a more spiritual temporality, as the characters in the films here are always seeking answers in astrologers and in monasteries, but ultimately they kind of find the answer in learning from their own experiences, that they're kind of everyday experiences that the long take seeks to kind of replicate. Okay. So the filmmaker's perspective is personified by the youngest character, Yang. He is a bit of a misfit, constantly teased and bullied by older girls around him until he finds a passion for photography. So just as the director pieces together separate shots into a feature-length movie, Yang uses his pictures to develop a more multifaceted understanding of life. And he explains, because no one sees what's directly behind them, he likes to take photos of the backs of people's heads. And that's what you see in this promotional poster as well. He tells his father, "You can see what I can't see, and I can see what you can't see. So how do I know what you can see? Aren't we only able to see half of something?" And so even though he's young, he's kind of making this larger philosophical claim that because everyone's perspective is partial, no one can know the totality. And if it's impossible to see the back of our heads, how can we say for sure that any of our singular perspectives are true? So this movie also sort of hints at how we can open our eyes to a more multi-perspectival and expansive world, sort of echoing the relativism and pluralism of Taoist thought. Okay. In this scene, Ting, the teenage daughter, is dreaming of her grandmother, who was in a coma for the majority of the movie. So this scene is actually a dream scene. And her grandma is alive and well. She gives her an origami butterfly that she then mysteriously finds in her hands when she's waking. And before she falls asleep in her dream, which is actually when she wakes up in real life, she asks Grandma, "Why is it that the world is never the way we think it is?" Okay. So while the references to Taoism have been largely implicit in the previous examples, here we have a direct reference to Zhuangzi's butterfly dream. And so I think the reason that this kind of Zhuangzi reference is here is because it's it's kind of referencing how Ting is, she has been feeling guilty about potentially causing her grandmother to trip and fall into a coma. And this scene kind of releases her from her guilt by imparting the wisdom that dreaming and waking, life and death are merely transformations from one state to another. So one is not necessarily more real or more significant, and the story illustrates the principle, the Taoist principle, the equality of things, a sense of equilibrium and willingness to let go of attachments to temporary states of being. So it kind of opens up a more cosmological space that allows Ting to accept the passing of her grandmother as simply part of the natural and inevitable transformations of life and death, just as waking transforms to dreaming. So at the end of the film, each of the family members arrive at a sense of spiritual acceptance of kind of all of the things they were struggling with during the course of the film. So the father, NJ, met up with his first love in Japan and then returns home to his wife. And despite the temptation of escapism and starting over with his first love, he kind of tells his wife, it's just, I suddenly realized if I were to start over, there's really no need, which for me is kind of gesturing as an almost enlightened stance of letting go of kind of the desire to be in this mortal world. All right, so that concludes my presentation, and thank you for your time.